Well, I think that we need to talk about the
Gorilla in the room.
the biggest gorilla there, which is the American election in November. Both of us have wrote before the election. You had a long article in Persuasion, or American Purpose, about what to expect, and I wrote several things along those lines as well. So we're now 2 days beyond the inauguration of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. How do you see any of those predictions shaping up?
I think we are heading into an extremely challenging and dangerous time for democracy in the United States. And the warnings, the anxieties, the fears of democratically committed scholars, analysts, law professors, political leaders, I think are rapidly being fulfilled. We, of course, need to wait to see several things. Number one, what's the full agenda going to be? Number two, how effective and organized are they going to be at implementing it? And number three, what kind of submission and compliance are they going to get, not only from Silicon Valley executives, but from the Congress and so on? And we don't quite know those answers yet. I think it'll be months before we fully know them. But the warning signs are very troubling. And it's not... So I think it's very important to distinguish between policies that we don't like or even might be appalled by, but that he has the legitimate legal right as President of the United States to pursue, and then the process can work itself out. The Congress can exert itself or not. Federalism can exert itself and contain what the federal government can do. And then actions that challenge democratic norms and institutions, or maybe even defy them, and potentially very frontally so. So today, he's, embarking on, today is January 22nd, a executive order to essentially dismiss or put on leave all the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers in the United States federal government. I think that's not the right approach. I, as you know, am not a fan of DEI. I think it needs to be rethought. But I'm a liberal Democrat, so I believe in a more measured and interactive approach, and kind of rethinking maybe how some of these people should be redeployed, how this should be rethought, and so on. But that's the style that we're going to see. You've written a lot about Schedule F. Interestingly, I would have thought that the implementation of Schedule F would have been like on day one. But
no, it was.
It was?
No, all that's in place, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, because that's not been the top... Mm-hmm. The top headline of the day one reporting. And what's that going to look like in practice?
Well, so for those that are not following this intensively, Schedule F was an executive order at the end of the first Trump administration that basically would have put all civil servants on a at-will basis so that they could simply be fired without cause. And it was rescinded because Trump lost the election and Biden reversed that. But now Trump has reversed Biden's reversal. And yes, there's definitely an executive order that they've. The thing that is actually in a way impressive is they've really thought this through.
Yeah.
And they're not simply reissuing Schedule F. They're doing it in a slightly different form that will make legal challenges more difficult. But they clearly want to be able to clear the decks of people they think are not loyal and put.
So what is the new form?
this gets into a lot of technicalities
Okay.
about the SES and senior executive service and expanding Schedule C appointments and so forth. I don't think
Okay.
that's a particular interest, but I think that the bigger issue that I can see clearly coming, this administration has issued a blizzard of executive orders in the first 48 hours of its administration. Some of them are, not so terrible. I mean, I agree with you that removing DEI officers is not going to end Western civilization, but challenging birthrights citizenship is a big, big deal
Yeah, I
because
was coming to that.
the 14th Amendment is pretty clear about the fact of the right of birthright citizenship, and that's one of the things that has been targeted. But I think also, if you step back a little bit, just the use of executive orders in this fashion is also going to lead to, I think, a really major constitutional crisis. Every single one of them is going to be challenged in the courts. Some of them will survive, some of them will be approved, but the real crisis is going to come when the courts tell Trump that he can't do something he really wants to do, including the U.S. Supreme Court, which has not
Right.
simply been a patsy, that has approved everything he wants. And at that point, it does seem to me you're going to face the possibility that Trump will be told that he can't do something by a
And he'll
court,
do it anyway.
a federal court, or even by the Supreme Court, and he'll do it anyway.
Yeah. So this was the speculation as well yesterday of one of the, I think, really great columnists in the United States today, someone we both know, David French, who's writing for the New York Times. David was in conversation on the New York Times podcast with Michelle Goldberg. And this was really his nightmare scenario. David, as you know, is a lawyer as well, that we could well get into a situation where the Supreme Court clearly and emphatically declares some of his executive orders or his other actions unconstitutional or illegal in some other way. And he just says, what Andrew Jackson said, the court has made its ruling, now let it enforce it.
Yeah, J.D. Vance repeated that. That's, by the way, an apocryphal saying. It's
Okay.
not historically established that Jackson actually
Oh,
said
thank
that.
you.
But,
I'm glad to hear that.
but nonetheless, I mean, the idea is in the air.
There is an obvious recourse in that regard, and that would be to impeach and remove the President of the United States for violating the Constitution. But that failed twice in the first term, and it seems to me there's virtually nothing I can imagine Donald Trump doing that would lead the current Speaker of the House and the current Republican majority in the House of Representatives to initiate impeachment proceedings during these first 2 years.
Right, so that check is simply gone. Let's talk a little bit about how things may play out, because some of the things he's doing, I think, have much more support. So, for example, closing the southern border is probably something that Biden should have done much, much earlier. And, as a principled matter, I have much less trouble with that than some of the other initiatives he's taken. I think one of the big question marks is economic policy, because he's renewed his threats of 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico. He obviously, at some point wants to go after China big time. And that is going to, I think, really rile his base, because it's going to lead to almost immediate inflation. I mean, how do you see that playing out?
I think, and I have felt for months, that his vulnerability in a second term will be the economy more than his abuse of power. And not only his love of tariffs, but just the generally erratic nature of his governance and the project that the Republicans seem to have of transferring wealth from the working and middle classes to the extreme wealthy. I mean, at some point, they're going to feel it in their pocketbooks. If we have inflation driven by tariffs, they'll feel it quite immediately when they try and buy things that we import. And it's bizarre that he still doesn't understand it. He was talking on election night, I think, about how rich we're going to get by foreigners paying money into our treasury from the tariffs, when it's the American consumer that pays these tariffs as a tax on the imports. But somehow he cannot get into his mind that it's not foreigners paying these tariffs. But in any case, I do think it's going to have inflationary pressure. I do think there's going to be, there could be some stimulus to investment by some tax breaks. But in the long run, in the medium run, I think 2 to 3 years, there's going to be a really felt effect among working and lower class voters. Now, if he brings manufacturing, and he well could, car manufacturing and so on, back to Detroit and create some jobs, I think that will be appreciated by working class voters in those states. But, if the result is that the prices of the products are higher, then we're back to the problem you talked about. I think, Frank, we are going to see an absolute staggering orgy of corruption and crony capitalism in the next 4 years, unlike anything we've seen since the late 19th century, the Gilded
Well, it's
Age.
going to be a lot worse than the Gilded Age. If you actually go back to some of these earlier scandals, teapot, I mean, they're kind of minor compared to the stuff that's going on.
But I think the comparison is the way the corporate titans of the era, Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc., Andrew Mellon, the percentage of the gross national product they controlled, we're already there, I'll bet, in terms of that percentage. But yes, I think you're right in terms of the scale. I wish you'd write about that, because people really haven't made that point.
Yeah.
So that's one vulnerability. There's a second vulnerability that's extremely interesting, and this certainly I didn't anticipate. I don't think you anticipated it. I don't know anybody who anticipated it. We saw Trump and the MAGA movement as isolationist and relentlessly critical of the indiscriminate, gratuitous use of force abroad. That was one of the things that Trump was most consistent about, it seemed, in his thinking and his arguments about world affairs. He wants the biggest, strongest military possible, and he doesn't want to use it. And now in his inaugural address, the only, if I'm remembering correctly, the only foreign policy issue he talked about, other than tariffs, if you want to call it that, is taking back the Panama Canal. And I implied he's going to use...
There's the Gulf of America also.
Well, that's a name change, but I think there's an implication there. And now, there's serious talk about deploying the United States military to go after the drug cartels in Mexico by designating them foreign terrorist organizations. There's certainly the looming shadow or veiled threat of possibly using coercion to retake the Panama Canal, to compel some sort of transfer of Greenland to the United States. And this will not go down well in the world or Latin America.
Well, it's certainly not going to go down well in the world and in Latin America. Question is how the American people are going to react to it. Are they actually going to worry about these new foreign entanglements, or when they see a map with an American flag over this largest island in the world, Greenland, are they going to cheer and say, yeah, boy, nobody thought of that before?
It's a good question, but I don't think that a coercive acquisition of the Panama Canal will be free of pushback in Latin America.
Oh, yeah, no question. Latin America is a complete, but Americans don't care what people in Latin America think of them. I think.
Well, I think that there could be sabotage. There could be a lot of non-cooperation. There could be a lot of welcoming of China into Latin American countries. It could well induce exactly the opposite effect of what we want to see.
Yeah. Okay, look, maybe one final issue that I want to cover is the emergence of all these tech oligarchs in American politics. I can't think of another person that's comparable to Elon Musk who, aside from being an extremely rich person, has used his wealth so politically. Not just in the United States, but around the world. Andrew Carnegie was interested in protecting his businesses. Mellon actually stepped in, to help the United States in the financial crisis in 1909, but didn't aspire to be, a political leader. And now you have this completely loose cannon who, as far as I can see, is untouchable. I mean, I think Musk's wealth makes it impossible for anyone to actually rein him in. And that can't be good for democracy.
I think it's very it's so obviously bad for democracy, it really doesn't require elucidation of the reasons why. There's no parallel in terms of the scale of his wealth, okay? I think there's a kind of parallel in Italy with Berlusconi, who was a media entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I'll note I just wrote a blog post on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, the argument is that, so that it was entitled Elon Musk and the Collapse of Western Civilization. I had written an earlier blog about how it was Silvio Berlusconi that was going to be discovered as a source of that collapse, because he was the first oligarch who used his business wealth to buy a media empire that then helped get him the prime ministership of Italy, and then once he was prime minister, he could protect his business interests using his political power. And that's exactly the scenario that Musk has followed with the acquisition of Twitter. It gives him a media platform.
Right.
He can influence politics, and now he's, the closest advisor to President Trump of anyone.
So a few observations and speculations here. Berlusconi. I think there are interesting parallels between Berlusconi and Trump. Trump never acquired a media empire, but they were both kind of natural populist politicians in their ability to communicate, and their self-absorption, their narcissism, but also their ability to use language to connect with, say, working class and middle class voters. I'd love to see almost a rhetorical comparison between Berlusconi and Trump. Berlusconi was an effective political communicator and politician and manipulator and so on. I think an interesting question, of course, there's all this debate now about what happens after Trump. One thing I think he will not be able to do is amend the Constitution to run for a third term or simply defy it. And so then who follows Trump? And of course, the most obvious speculation is Vance. Another speculation is Donald Trump Jr. But, I mean, it's imaginable that Musk could say, well, you had Trump come in with no experience. Now I've got more experience than he has.
Trump anticipated this. He actually gave a talk where he said that Elon Musk, don't worry, Elon Musk cannot be president because he wasn't born in the United States.
Thank you. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
That's and that isn't going to be modified either. So that's a very important point. So I think that Musk, the speculation that Musk and Trump are inevitably headed toward some cataclysm or parting of the ways is a little bit too glib and facile. But I think there's something to it, those two huge egos wrestling with one another. So we'll see what happens.
And you've already got this chasm that's opened up in the MAGA right, where the Laura Loomers and the real nativists do not like H-1B visas. And
yeah. So that's an interesting debate too, and I think it will be very important to see how that happens. And by the way, the discussion of visas returns us to the economic issue. If they really go after all of the undocumented aliens in the U.S., undocumented immigrants that they vow to go after, we're not going to have anyone to pick the crops, to milk the cows, to butcher the cattle. We're going to have shortages in the United States and inflation in food prices actually pretty rapidly, probably in the next few months. So it'll be interesting to see if Trump tries to fix that or not. There was a very interesting interview with a pro-Trump agricultural producer recently, I think possibly in Florida, just in despair about where he's going to find the workers to pick his crops. Returning to the tech moguls, I really think it is alarming the speed with which, the zeal with which, the cravenness with which they have bent the knee to kiss the ring of Donald Trump.
And they're all given front row at the inauguration.
Well, it turns out to be back row, but
okay.
very proximate positions of honor, embedded with the family and the close political allies. And certainly Trump and the people who work for him are quite skillful at using those sorts of scenes symbolically to send messages about, who is submitting and who is in favor. So I think this concentration of wealth, power, and control over information is truly, truly dangerous for liberal democracy. And to return to the question on which we started, 2024 was looking like, on balance, a pretty good year for democracy, a kind of pushing back, if not reversal, against the Democratic Recession and against a lot of instances of democratic backsliding, and a reaffirmation of the promise of elections as a vehicle for doing that. And we had gotten that message in October of 2023 with the Polish elections. We'll see what the Polish presidential elections this spring bring. It was hopeful, and then we had an autocrat elected as president of the United States, and in the first 3 days, he is revealing himself to be every bit as authoritarian in implementation as we were worried he seemed to be in intent. And so I think we're headed for a crisis.
Yeah, and they've obviously thought a great deal about the mistakes they made in the first term, and they're doing a lot to change those. And I think the primary recognition they've had is that it's all about personnel.
Yeah.
If you don't have the right people, you can't implement your policies. And that's really, they've been laser focused on getting the right people in positions of power.
And without going into the details of Schedule F, I do think it's revealing that when the architects of this plan and the general scenario for the second Trump administration, were thinking about this and talking about this to the press, they said, we don't really need to fire a lot of people. We just need to hang the sword of Damocles over them, over the federal civil servants. And then I think the rest of the quote was literally, and they will behave.
Right. Okay, Larry Diamond.
Good talking to you, Frank.
Yeah. So we'll have to reconvene. We're only 2 days into the new administration, and I think we'll have to keep monitoring this, and
Yes.
in a few weeks or months.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Okay. Thanks, Larry.
Okay, Frank.
All right.
Thank
very
you.
good.